I There we go. I think I'm going to introduce Jeff Dungan first. Jeff, it's great to have you on today. And you kind of took us around to your team and everybody was allowed to kind of talk about what they do and their implication here. So I appreciate that. Guys, thank you guys for joining so much. Shameless plug really quick. Next week, we got Effects Luminaire, something we're really looking forward to. Lighting, yes, in winter, but now's the chance. So join me on next week's discussion. And from all of us, thank you guys so much. Jeff, I'm going to hand it off to you. Thanks, buddy.
Okay. So we'll do just a few quick introductions as we haven't gotten to spend time with this team before. First of all, thank you very much for taking some of your time with us today. You will find that at least everything I'm going to cover is unscripted. So if you want to check it against what we said earlier, I think that recording is available as well. But in way of introduction, and then we'll get kind of rolling into the content. I'm the COO for Snap One. I was legacy Control 4 and had lots of different responsibility across that organization prior to merging with Snap, and have been with the company, the combined company, for 15 years. So some experience. Prior to that, I worked for a Celestica, which is one of the big 5 contract manufacturers globally, and drove a big chunk of all of their US operations, including all of the manufacturing and supply chain functions. Before that, I was with HP, and I also was in manufacturing with HP, driving logistics, or pardon me, supply chain and manufacturing for the workstation division. So it's a little bit about my background. I'm from Indiana. I don't have a dog in the hunt for the Braves, you know, what's happening as far as baseball is concerned. But I'm surely pulling for Brian because he seems to be very emotionally wrapped up in it. We'll let the others introduce themselves, and then we'll get rolling into the content.
So I'll go next. I'm Nathan Porter. I'm the Senior Vice President of Operations in Jeff's organization. I am responsible for logistics, fulfillment, and demand planning for the business. I've been with, I was with Legacy Snap AV before we turned to Snap One. So I've been here for roughly 6 years. Prior to that, I spent 15 years at General Motors, where I actually did lead outbound logistics operations for GM. So logistics, we're going to talk a lot about it. Got a lot of experience in there. And I'm not rooting for Brian's Braves. I think Brian's Braves have won enough. So with that, I will send it over to Brian.
Thank you, Nathan. Appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little bit of what's going on in the supply chain world today. I'm the Vice President of Global Supply Chain, reporting in the Jeff's operations team. Our supply chain team is responsible for sourcing and procurement and supplier quality. I've been with Snap One for 5 years now. Prior to Snap One, I spent 30+ years in many different operational roles, from purchasing, demand planning, inventory planning, a plant manager, reverse logistics, and most importantly, our strategic sourcing activities for companies such as NCR and Radiant Systems. So we'll look forward to sharing a little bit more as we get into the discussions here later on. With that, Andy, I'll turn it over to you.
The dreaded find the mute button challenge. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody. I'm Andy Balassi, Senior Business Development Manager here at Snap One. I also come from the Legacy Snap AV side of the business. I just realized with the company, will be 8 years as of Saturday. So I've got a couple days to meet the 8-year mark. Prior to that, I do not have the logistics and supply chain expertise that these fine gentlemen do, but I've worked very closely with all of them, and I truly believe they're an excellent team, very dedicated and very well versed in what they do. My background, actually, I came into the Snap One organization from operations management, from the standpoint of running tech crews. So I'm a little bit closer to what field techs do out there. And the last company I worked for was Dish Network, running their Charlotte office of about 90 or so technicians, supervisors, all that stuff. So a little bit of that field experience to go along with the product side. So with that, Jeff, I'll let you take it away.
Clearly, though, Andy, based on your background, it looks like you're sitting at the port, so you've got some logistics.
Yes, it's a live feed. I'm sitting here at the port. You'll hear the horn in the background in a second. So.
All right, so just a few things to talk about before we get into the content. The first is, as I believe everybody should now be aware, we recently went public, and as a public company, there's something called a quiet period that exists from the time that you physically end a quarter until the time that you make your public quarterly announcement. And we are in the middle of that period right now. And all that means is that we're going to be open and talk about a lot about kind of what happened in the global supply chain that got us to this state kind of that everybody's dealing with. We're going to talk about specifics in terms of what we're doing to address and mitigate a bunch of those challenges. But we're not going to be making any references to our third quarter. We won't talk about anything specifically that could give you any insights into how our third quarter turned out, or even any insights into anything to do with revenue shipments. So feel free to ask any questions. There may be some questions that we just have to say we can't answer because we're in a quiet period right now. We will talk about how we've performed in certain areas of the supply chain, but when we're talking about that, we're talking about the previous performance prior to Q3. And so there won't be any specific references to Q3 in anything that we say or answer. So I wanted to get that kind of understood up front so we didn't cause confusion later. But again, we're not asking you to avoid asking questions. You're free to ask any questions you want. There are a few very sensitive questions we may not be able to answer directly. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that whenever we're focused on kind of the macro environment issues that happen in the supply chain that kind of got us to where we are, we will also talk about the processes that we're putting in place or that we've put in place to address the things that we're dealing with, that we're struggling with on the supply chain side, or actually on the supply chain and fulfillment and logistics side. Again, all of that is stuff that we have put in place. Actually, most of it are things that we put in place before the beginning of 2021, as we were dealing with the demand coming out of the initial shutdown from COVID. And we've improved upon those things, but none of the things we're talking about are things that we just put in place again in Q3. So for that reason, none of this is considered private information that gives you as a potential investor more information than other people in the market might have. And so just wanted to be clear about that as well. All right, with those PSAs out of the way. So I was asked to kind of start by just explaining some of the history that led to what's going on with the overall global supply chain. And so I'll do that as quickly as I can. The reality is there are so many factors that led us to where we are that I can't talk about all of them in one sitting, but I'll talk about the main things that impacted us to get us to where we are. And I should note, there are definitely analysts and people who that's their whole job and get paid a lot of money, who try to understand what happens in the global economy that leads to certain outcomes. I'm not one of those people, but I and my team have lived through everything we're going to talk about, and so we've got a bunch of insights that we're happy to share. So with that, really to talk about what's going on in today's supply chain, you have to start by going back to the initial shutdown in the US due to COVID. When that happened early in 2020, nobody really knew what the impact was going to be. And the reality is that all companies, even very large companies, don't keep enough cash on hand to weather 6 months of no revenue. All companies are incented for their investors to generate value for their partners and for their customers, to leverage the cash that they have on hand. So you just don't keep around, and you all probably preaching to the choir, but you just don't keep around enough cash to go through a huge downturn in incoming revenue. And so as all companies, including us, began to prepare for a downturn in revenue, that none of us knew exactly how long it would last. And there were predictions, by the way, at the time that it might last 6 months. And so as all companies were preparing for that, including ourselves, the focus had to be on working capital, because we can't continue to operate as a company and serve our channel and serve our customers if we run out of cash. So just like we did, as we were going into that shutdown, we actually pushed out around $50 million of our orders. This was well over a year ago now. And we had to take action in order to make sure we preserve working capital. Very large companies had to do the exact same thing. And so as everybody was acting independently and making decisions to make sure they remain solvent, a lot of those independent actions ended up kind of colliding and making a bad situation much worse. And so a few of the things that fed into that is, particularly starting out, the rental car companies who normally have a sequence throughout the year where they sell off some of their fleet that's aged as used cars and then replace it with new cars. They decided that in order to generate the cash that they needed to weather the storm, they were going to sell off their entire fleet of cars, even the ones that were fairly new or just purchased. And so at the time, if you were in the market for a used car, it was a great time to be in the market for a used car. There was a flood initially of cars available. But then as we started to recover as an economy and started to go back to work just months later, unfortunately, there were no used cars available, or there were no rental cars available. If you remember, we went through a period where it was almost impossible to get a rental car. And that's because the rental car companies, after having sold off all of their assets, now as demand was starting to come back, they turned around and placed a full year's worth of orders that would normally be spread out across 12 months, with the car manufacturers having a plan to deliver those things. They turned around and placed all the orders for those cars overnight. And so what happened was a couple of things. One is obviously no rental cars available, but the car manufacturers who had also reacted and pushed out their demand expectations now had to react and pull back in all of the demand, not just for that period, but for an entire year. And that's why, kind of coincidental with hearing there were no rental cars available, you started to hear none of the car manufacturers have enough chips to manufacture their cars. And so that created this unique blip in demand that was on the leading edge of a recovery that was taking place worldwide. So if you park that piece of information, the other things that were happening globally is that several of the chip manufacturers had received all these push outs from manufacturers like us. The chip suppliers reacted to that, and they furloughed or fired a bunch of their workforce, including some of the main foundries. There's only really 3 or 4 foundries that deal with most of the wafers that get put into consumer electronics, chips that get put into consumer electronics. And so that workforce left. Many of them were traveled back to their home regions, and many of them didn't actually return to work as the recovery was happening. So there was a lack of overall capacity in terms of being able to generate more chips to satisfy all of the demand. At the same time, people were at home and spending more time at home than they had for years. And as all of us did, whenever we went back home, we realized there were things we could do to improve our household. And that included everything from, buying a new stereo, maybe getting some new appliances, in our industry, including some automation technology. And so all of that, coupled with the fact that there was a bunch of cash being injected into into the economy in the form of COVID relief money, that, you know, there was no way at the time to target all of that cash just to the people who really needed it. And so the way that it was done is it was kind of like, you know, a rain shower. Everybody got wet with some additional income. And that additional income found its way into purchase of consumer electronics. And so we had this initial spike of demand for a bunch of components caused by the auto industry. We then layered onto that a bunch of increased new demand for consumer electronics and appliances at the very time that that the industry that supports all of that had just kind of shuttered down and pushed out all of their capacity. So the reality is, anytime you're in a situation where you're needing to recover from not having enough of something, while the demand for that is also increasing, it just takes a very long time to recover. And so that's at its root the key things that happened that caused us to be in this global supply predicament. There were a couple of other things that also happened that added to the challenge. One is, I mentioned that there are very few foundries. One in particular, TSMC, has had a real difficulty in terms of getting back to its original capacity, but certainly is not hitting its plans to increase capacity as it normally would to support the increase in overall global demand. So chip manufacturers that work with TSMC are continuing to struggle more so than many others. And then on top of that, there was, you probably heard, there's been many things like this because it seems to be when it rains, it pours. There was a factory fire from one of the leading audio chip component manufacturers. They only had 3 factories globally, so a third of their total ability to produce chips just went up in smoke. And all of that demand, because they were one of the largest audio chip suppliers, a third of their capacity went away. All of that demand ended up hitting multiple other chip suppliers and just causing real delays in the ability to get chips for audio products in particular. So all of that combined kind of led us to this situation where it's very difficult to get all of the raw materials needed to manufacture product. We manufacture with both contract manufacturers with our own full in-house design, but we also manufacture with joint development manufacturers who have a design of something that we like, and then we just work with them to modify it to make it so that it's even better for our channel. In both of those cases, any of the electronic devices that we sell will have between 70 and I quoted last time 350 because that's pretty common, but we do have some products with almost 1,000 unique components on them. But if you have the right component, like a processor that is unique, that the whole product is designed around, and all of a sudden the supplier of that processor decommits, in other words, says, I know that you accepted my PO at lead time, it's a valid PO. Unfortunately, I just don't have the supply for you. So I'm not going to fulfill the PO. I'm going to put you on allocation and try to fulfill it later. In some cases, we've even gotten just refusal to supply at all. So not just an allocation or a push out, but refusal to supply at all. One of those chips hitting makes it so you just can't manufacture the product. And so as we continued, and Brian's going to talk a lot more about this, but as we continue to focus on how to keep the chip supply coming, it ends up being something that's a very large task as we manufacture across more than 200 suppliers with 4,000 products. So we keep pretty busy in that front. And then the other aspect to all of this is what happened on the logistics side. And really the key on the logistics side, Nathan we'll talk more about this. The key on the logistics side is it was really just a matter of capacity constraint, because as all of the demand started hitting, a lot of manufacturing still being done in Southeast Asia, not just by us, but globally. That's still, even with the move away from China, a lot of manufacturing stayed in Southeast Asia. And so as all of this demand for additional new consumer goods started flowing in, it completely shifted the normal course of flow for logistics and made it so that we had things like container shortages and not enough capacity in ports. And we're still dealing with that some in the Port of LA. But the other thing that happened is that the consumer airline industry stopped traveling to China and stopped traveling to Asia. And most of the air freight that we actually do between Asia and the US happens on consumer airlines. So you're flying on Delta, you're flying home from a business trip to China, almost certainly you in the belly of that airplane will be freight that's being paid for by some company to get air freight back to us. So when the consumer airlines stopped having as many trips, it put a huge constraint on the ability to move product via air freight, which we've also been recovering from. So that's kind of the high level macro environment that led us to where we are from a global supply chain perspective today and continues to put pressure on us. We'll come back and talk and answer some questions around kind of what we're hearing from the industry in terms of recovery as we get later into the discussion. But now I'll pause and let Brian talk a little bit more about what we're doing from a supply chain perspective to address everything that's going on in the industry. And then Nathan will cover the same for logistics.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. And as Jeff went over that detailed version of all the supply chain challenges we have, and there seems like there's endless amount of them these days. I thought it would be worthwhile sharing with you the supply chain organization and how we're structured to basically take on those challenges and combat those challenges and what we are going to be facing in the future. So we have over 40 professionals in the supply chain organization, globally dispersed between Taiwan, China, Malaysia, Australia, and the US, mirroring very much the complexion of our supply base of those 225 plus suppliers that we're managing today. And as I alluded to earlier, the three different disciplines that we have in supply chain, starting with strategic sourcing, where they are focused on making sure that we have the right selected supplier partner, and then really developing and culturing that supplier partner to make sure that they're meeting our strategic and aligned with our strategic objectives. One of the big changes in sourcing over the years here, specifically since COVID, is really the ability to identify risk as early as possible and remedy those risks. And that it takes on a new complexion to be able to not only understand the supply chain at the finished goods level, but to dive down deeper into that bill of material and go down multiple levels to understand the entire supply chain to make sure that you can truly identify where risks may impact your business. In addition, the supply chain, or excuse me, the sourcing team is coordinating the commercial aspects. This gets into the supplier agreement that we have in place, which gets into pricing, terms, warranty, things of that nature. Our what I call the proactive procurement team, they're really our first line of interacting with the supplier partner. They're the ones that have that relationship on a day in, day out basis, and may be the first to hear when there is a disruption in the supply chain that will impact our business. So we rely on that procurement team to share information and be transparent to our sourcing team to, one, identify those risks as early as possible to put remedies in place. The purchasing team is also focused in on providing a forecast visibility. And that forecast at one time was focused on a rolling 6 to 12 months worth of visibility. We'll talk about what we're doing to combat some of the challenges with forecasting. And then the purchasing team is also working on, putting together POs to cover the lead times that are continuing to extend out day in and day out. The last part of our organization is the local supplier quality engineering team. And these are our eyes, ears, feet on the street. So there's our on-site presence of at the supplier partner to help manage through these concerns that are happening either at a product level, a program level, just any business concern that may be happening on site where they can get involved as quickly as possible since they're dealing with that personally. As we just talked about from a supply chain challenge, we talk about the COVID-19. COVID-19 itself has had impacts on the supply chain from geographies that are locked down. We've seen lockdowns on certain geographies, parts of Vietnam, parts of Malaysia, parts of Taiwan. Unfortunately, we've been seeing some release and improvements on those lockdowns, but that's been one of our challenges, just making sure that we understand where those risks are and when those occur, how we're going to attack that. And we'll talk about a little what we've done to help mitigate that activity. We talked about lack of resources, specifically from a people perspective, having enough resources to keep up with the ongoing demand, which is a good thing. We've had significant upside from a customer demand perspective, simply because of the focus on home improvements and home investments. And then obviously the biggest thing that we deal with almost on a day in, day out basis has been managing the extended lead times, the material allocations at the raw material level, the supplier decommits that are occurring across, ICs, aluminum, glass, you have it. We've dealt with it over the last 18 to 24 months. Now, some of the strategies that we put in place relative to how do we combat with those challenges, and I want to give credit to the entire operations team. I'm going to focus a little bit on the supplier quality team and the sourcing team and the purchasing team. These 40 individuals are making the difference. It's their knowledge in the industry, their knowledge and relationships that they have with our supplier partners, and the tireless work ethic that they're putting in relative to winning the challenges on a day in and day out basis. And they are the ones that are truly making a difference in the day in, day out opportunities. One of the big things we're just talking about in terms of the lockdowns that are happening from a geography perspective. Our China Plus strategy, or our supplier diversification strategy, has been a big part of our success there, meaning that when we have suppliers, they have multiple operations. So if there's a lockdown in one geography, they have the ability to move product to an alternative geography. And that has helped us mitigate some of those risks when we have potential lockdowns. From a people resource perspective, where there's been impacted by COVID or people just not wanting to return to work, we're working directly with our supplier partners to understand their staffing levels. And in addition to the staffing levels, understanding what their constraints are, whether it is the ability to keep the staff there from a wage alignment perspective, and understanding what they're doing to get better aligned from a wage perspective, as well as from a customer prioritization perspective, making sure we understand where the Snap One sits across their entire customer portfolio, and making sure that we are at the top of that list relative to priorities as things are being allocated across their portfolio. We talked about the purchasing team in terms of the forecast that they're providing, and we had typically provided anywhere from 6 to 12 months. Well, we're seeing lead times at the component level stretching out, as great as 52 weeks or greater. We've had one supplier that's now quoting 65 weeks for a component. In that case, we're working with Nathan's demand planning organization, which has had to do a fair amount of work relative to making sure that we have the ability to provide a forecast that has that much horizon built into it. So making sure that they understand, and we're feeding that information back to where those lead times exist, and making sure that we can provide a forecast horizon that supports the extended lead times that are occurring. Where we can and provide additional PO coverage, we're providing that PO coverage either at a component level or a finished goods level based on the lead times and where we feel that there has been risk components. And one of the other items that we've done to secure from an inventory perspective, we talk about buffer inventory or the raw material constraints that are out there in the world today, making sure that we have identified where those long lead times or challenge components are and securing that raw material item. So really calling it buffer inventory. One of the primary questions that comes up in these conversations is, when are we going to return to normal? And the important part of that question, or the answer to that, is really, let's make sure that we can truly define what that new normal state is, because things won't go back to the way they were before. We've seen too many challenges, and we're seeing too many changes in our supply chain culture. So what we're making sure of is that we understand those challenges, aligning our new strategies, recruiting resources and placing resources where they're going to be beneficial to mitigating these risks. One of those things that we were just talking about was the supplier diversification and geography diversification, making sure that we have alternatives and can be agile when we need to relative to moving product based on certain constraints, either in geographies or borders. The other part is making sure that we understand the multiple levels of the supply chain, not just the finished goods aspect of it, but diving down deeper into the bill of material and understanding the multiple levels and sub-suppliers that are providing that, to truly understand where the constraints might be and to drive agility back into the supply chain as we're working all the way from the planning to the execution phase of delivery fulfillment. And then the other part is making sure that to be able to scale our business, making sure that we have business processes and systems that can help us identify those risks as quickly as possible and on a more frequent basis to help our remedy and review and ultimately implementation of the systems and processes to help us mitigate risk in the future. Thought that would be a good segue into transition to Nathan and what's going on in the logistics world.
Thanks, Brian. I'm trying to find the unmute now. Specific to logistics fulfillment and demand planning, the organization that we have a Snap One that supports your business needs is roughly 200 to 220 people, depending on where we are during the year, as we flex up and flex down based on your requirements. As we think about what's happened since COVID, there's a lot of activity that's happened in order to support the business needs as they've changed. I think one thing that I'll touch on from a logistics perspective and try to give you a little bit more insight as to why we've seen such challenges since COVID started. And it really goes into two different things. If you think about the ocean liners that move our freight, historically, this is a really margin challenged business. Obviously with lots of CapEx that's required in order to participate. So they're very conscious about how much capacity they have to move freight tonnage. And historically, over the last 5 years pre-COVID, they've taken a lot of that capacity out. And so as we started to see the volume rebound in a way that we weren't expecting, the way they weren't expecting, they struggled to be able to handle all of the capacity needs that the global economy required. I think in conjunction with that, I think it's important to recognize that in logistics, when you stop trading at a consistent balanced rate, you become incredibly unbalanced and you end up with, empty containers, not where they're supposed to be. And so as you think about what we're seeing in terms of containers, that's a huge part of it. We call it the lead lag effect, where we have a bunch of capacity and then suddenly it's all gone because it hasn't circulated back to its origin. Those are all things that are impacting, the logistics issues that we're seeing. On the fulfillment side, of course, everybody is hearing, they're learning about labor shortages. We're all seeing it. We have not been immune to that either. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about logistics and fulfillment. Brian's already touched on demand planning, so I won't talk about that. But logistics and fulfillment, I'll touch a little bit about what we're doing to help alleviate the situation. And so on the logistics side, we are working with multiple providers, both FedEx as well as C.H. Robinson as our freight forwarder, and some regional LTL and FTL providers in the US in order to get out, prioritize the things that we know that you are waiting on. And so it's a lot of daily contact, it's a lot of daily communication. It's really trying to understand where is everything in the supply chain and pushing the things that are really needed further up the stream so that we can get those faster. Now on the fulfillment side, as we all know, I touched upon it, labor shortages are at play. We've implemented some productivity type mechanisms to help really incentivize our employees to get product out the door faster in a quality fashion. And so we've seen some good progress in Q1, Q2 really getting productivity up and more packages out. So with that, I think we can pivot into the rest of the Q&A. Andy, if you have some, we can start walking through those.
Absolutely. A headset from a long day of webinar stuff was charging it, so it takes a second to sync up. But yeah, so I appreciate all the feedback and input from you all. So I think we've got some questions in previously from some of our partners, and so we have those ready to go. But please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A section. We'll be happy to answer those as well. I don't see any at the moment, so we can refer to some of the ones that we had received previously or before the webinar. So. And I think most of them are for the entire group, but anyone who Jeff, Brian, Nathan, feel free to chime in. So the first one. I think and a big one that's really beneficial to our partners. Any suggestions on how our partners can plan forecast for their business? Anything that we can offer them as a way of suggestions and ways that they can operate to help themselves out?
Yeah, there's no perfect answer here, but we, as I mentioned, and maybe I'll spend a little bit of time explaining this, but as I mentioned, that we are not immune to getting decommits from our component suppliers that provide the components that go into our products. It's happening all the time. Unfortunately, there is no pre-warning that when that's going to happen. None of the component suppliers pre-communicate that they're going to run out of stock. None of them tell us that there's an issue that's coming and they're going to be on allocation. And so when those things hit, they come as a surprise to us and we're reactive. What Brian talked about, we spend a lot of time and energy looking out 3 months from now and working with all of our supply base to get clear to build schedules, what we call clear to build schedules, meaning we want you to go and confirm from your entire supply chain that you can meet all of our demand for the next 3 months. And if you can't, we want you to highlight that now so that we'll have time to address it before 3 months from now hits and you just don't have the components or the people or whatever other resources they may be short. So we spend an awful lot of time working with all of our suppliers, looking way out in advance of what we would normally do under normal business conditions to try to clear all of those issues. But when a major component supplier decommits, it still comes as a surprise and we have to react. So the reason why I started with all of that is we can't tell you about products that we're going to have a challenge with in the future due to specific component shortages, as those are things that we find out about and either we resolve quickly or they start to impact us some on the supply side. But history is a good predictor of the future. And so where we have had products that have been under supply challenge and they're products that you use in your business all the time, those products, I wouldn't recommend that you just start placing orders to get on the back order list without demand, but those would be the ones that, to the extent that you have visibility and you're going to need them, you have demand for them, don't wait until the last minute to place those orders. We focus on, we understand the pain that we cause you guys in our channel whenever we don't have product available. So we focus on the products that are out of stock on a daily basis. And we work really hard to try to come up with mitigations and try to get them back in stock. We try to keep the amount of time you have to dwell on back order to a minimum. But on those products where you've seen us be supply challenged and that they're products you use, as soon as you're going to be building them into a project, that's a good time to place an order rather than waiting till the last minute. So that's really the best guidance I can give on that question.
Good, awesome, thank you. We do have a couple questions that popped in. No surprise on this one. It's similar to one we had in the earlier session. And I think Nathan and I answered it, but it's from Nicholas Lee. Our Snap AV ETA date's pretty accurate on back order items, i.e. episode response, DSPMs. And I think there's two pieces of that, because obviously we've got our own products, proprietary products, as well as our third-party products. But Nathan, you want to tackle that one or take it on?
Yeah, sure. So the ETAs that you see on the portal or the website they are as accurate as we know them to be. Now, I think what you see sometimes is those ETAs may be delayed because of port congestion, labor shortages to pull freight out of the ports, which are unknown when those ETAs are developed. We try to change them as quickly as possible to make them as relevant and as accurate as we can, but they are as accurate as we can get them when they are there. And yeah. I think that's specific to 1P product or our like house brands. Andy's going to talk a little bit about the third-party brands.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Yeah, specific to our third-party brands, so those that we distribute, the ETAs that we have, it gets a little bit more difficult because obviously this leadership group is not necessarily responsible for getting that product in, right? We have to rely on the manufacturers. So the dates that you see on the website, and we also have some language on the website on the products affected. And so the dates that you see are dates of when we're getting our next allocation. So with everything that's happened and the team here has laid out nicely for you guys as far as a backdrop, every manufacturer is affected differently. So the dates that we have, there may be different impacts. So we get allocated product. Now, we have great purchasing power as an organization and as a distributor. So we do get a lot of product. The date that you see when we get allocation, we fill our back orders. The first orders that we received on that product are the first ones that we fill. And usually what we get as far as product from our vendor partners is not enough to fill all the back orders. So then you'll see that date change to the next available allocation or the next best date we have as far as allocation from the specific vendor. So that's why you might see some of those dates change often. So the best kind of course and method that we can suggest, and we also suggest it in the messaging we have on the website, is to place back orders, because we will always fill those back orders first. So hopefully that helped to answer that question. We've got a couple other ones that popped in. Is the increased focus on house brands products seen as a positive move in resolving the overall situation of supply chain issues? This seems to be a bit counterintuitive at times. And that was from anonymous, but so I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that. Well, there's a lot rolled up in there.
Certainly, and feel free to come back with a follow-on question if this doesn't fully answer your question. But the reality is that we have way more control over the supply chain on what we're calling our house brands or our first-party brands. The processes we've put in place and the investments that we make on a daily basis to deal with the stuff that we've designed or that we bring to market are much more effective when we control that supply chain. And so the one answer to your question is we've had much more effect at managing and being able to keep supply going of those first party brands than we have the ability to influence large third-party partners who basically, are reacting to us being a good partner and us helping flow through a lot of volume. And so they're giving us our unfair share of demand. But at the end of the day, we can't solve their deep supply chain issues. So we're still at, we're at the whim of their ability to get supply and make it available. So that said, we continue to focus, and I think that this is something you should see in our local stores and even in e-commerce. We continue to focus on choice, and we very much want to provide the best choice available in all of our categories. So we're not at all opposed to third-party brands. We try to focus on making sure we've got the best selection of those third-party brands available, and to the extent that we can, we try to keep them in stock as well.
Yeah, hopefully, and whoever did submit that question, if there's anything follow-on question that maybe we didn't touch or that Jeff didn't touch on, happy to answer that. This is from Steve. Is there a report that's available or can be shared that gives us an estimated lead time of items based on current knowledge, example, instead of just seeing back orders?
Yeah, so there is no one report that makes it so that you could see what the overall future back order situation is going to be. There are just too many variables in the equation across the 4,000 products we provide from all of the suppliers. What we do try to do is use the web portal as a means of communicating the next known availability. And so the best place to hit that is through the web portal. We can respond to requests coming in through the sales channel if there is a specific ask for a specific product for that's important to a project. We can take those queries coming in through our field sales team and research those and help on specific product questions. Of course, we can't do that for every single product because there's just not enough hours in the day. But if you have a specific concern that's going to impact you, if there's not availability, I would recommend that you bring that. Just ask your sales support, and then they'll work with us to get you an answer.
Awesome. No questions in the Q&A right now, but one that came in earlier. I think this might be on people's minds as if they're hearing and or watching news related to some of the things going on a macro level. If logistics remains constrained, we will see such items such as food receive priority, or basic necessities receive priority, prolonging then the availability of other products.
Right, and I think that a lot of that has already happened. There's now a well-established definition of what essential products are that take priority in basically the entire supply chain. And certainly when, for instance, the vaccines were being produced and finally released at volume, there was a huge interruption for FedEx and a couple of other large service providers because they had to focus on that. Outside of that one kind of blip in the recent 6 months, there really hasn't been any other category that has that's pulled enough volume to detract from the rest of the supply chain that I'm aware of. Now that there's enough capacity on the logistics side that the individual constraints are not being driven by any single category.
All right. And one other one that we may have covered tangentially, but what impact does vendors or manufacturers' size have on the ability to recover?
Right. So this one, and then I also will cycle back and cover the question about kind of estimated time for recovery on different things. So I'll cover those too. So really, size doesn't guarantee success. So there are very, very large companies that are struggling on the supply chain side because they had I'm going to say the wrong component. They had a critical component designed in like a processor that just the manufacturer can no longer supply. And so whenever that happens, the only option is to go through a redesign. And those redesign cycles can take anywhere between 10 and 18 months. And so you've seen some very large companies having to shut down whole lines of categories of products just because chips aren't available. So size doesn't guarantee success is the first point. But where size does help, and where it's helped with us, is you do have the capital necessary to make sometimes very expensive purchasing decisions on behalf of your customers. And so that's really one of the focuses that we've driven. You heard Brian talking about how we try to look way in advance to help resolve all the different types of constraints that all of our suppliers are dealing with. You heard Nathan talking about the fact that he's got a team that is actively on the phone with multiple carriers every day, trying to get our containers prioritized, trying to get air freight going. All that stuff costs a ton of money. And so the one place where size does help is, there's this thing called purchase price variance whenever you're dealing with components, where you have a standard cost, which is what's built into the normal cost that we buy products for. But then if you have to, the only way to purchase a component is to pay more for it than what's built in the standard cost, that creates a purchase price variance, or a PPV. And, I've said fairly broadly that this year I've been spending as much in a week in PPV. I've approved as much in a week in PPV as I would normally do in a quarter in any given other time. And there have been some weeks when I've approved more PPV than I would historically do in a year. Similarly, Nathan is the main approver for air freight. And I believe, Nathan, it's a true statement that you're probably approving more air freight in a month right now than you normally would in a quarter. And so we're able to spend all that money in order to address these challenges. And that is something that you get from scale and size. So we're very fortunate to be in that position. But the other thing that's we're very fortunate to have is the teams of people that Brian and Nathan both spoke about that have industry experience and can actually help our suppliers go source components, and that have the industry experience to actually know how to negotiate improvement and prioritization for what's getting offloaded off of the ships, for instance. So those things are just benefits we have because we have really great teams, and we're just fortunate to be in a position of leading those teams. So that's probably all I can say about the scale question.
Yeah.
I want to make sure before we end here that we'll give you some insights, because I know this is something that everybody's got on their mind, is when is the recovery going to happen? And the answer is, in certain areas, the recovery has happened. In other areas, it's still going to take a long time. And we are only able to talk about, because we're trying to understand and analyze all this ourselves. We're only able to talk about the information provided to us by our network of suppliers, and we have a broad network of suppliers, so we get maybe a little bit more information. But what I'm going to talk about is the general timelines for recovery. None of this, there are no guarantees. This is all unprecedented with what we're dealing with. But there are some things that are happening that we think are indicators of where all this is going. And the first is that if you just look at the component side, I talked a lot about the expense of having to chase down components and the impact of not having components available. If you look at the component side, we have had some of the larger component manufacturers signaling that they're going to start to see some recovery in Q4 of this year. That said, we also have some key component suppliers that are signaling they're not going to recover until the end of 2022. And some of that is to do with which suppliers had focused on investments to increase capacity in 2021 and in 2022, which ones pushed out all of that stuff during their reaction to the COVID shutdown and haven't been able to recover as quickly. So while we anticipate the overall volume, the number of component suppliers that are going to have problems is going to start to decrease in Q4 and then show improvement throughout 2022, we can't then correlate that to say that means we're not going to have as many component supply issues, because we know that there is another group of key component suppliers that are going to struggle through 2022. And again, in almost all of our electronic products, there are certain components that only takes one component not being available and we can't manufacture the product. So we anticipate we're still going to be struggling through the supply chain challenges through all of 2022 as far as the component supply is concerned. our job might get a little bit easier because we won't be dealing with as many different components, but it's certainly not going to get easier in terms of solving the ones that will hit us. The second thing to talk about is air freight. And air freight, we believe, we've seen some signaling that it's going to continue to be very constrained and therefore very expensive through at least the first quarter of 2022. That really doesn't have an impact on our overall ability to provide product, because that really just comes down to us spending money. And as I've already mentioned, we're already we're already in the game of spending a lot of money. So we'll continue to spend money where we need to on air freight, where we have opportunities to bring in product that's out of stock. And just some of that constraint, the ability to get it here as quickly as possible, should go away sometime around the end of Q1 of 2022. Of course, that can change, but that's what we're hearing right now. And then on the ocean freight side, one of the things we didn't talk about, a recent situation, is that Southern China is dealing with rolling brownouts. And so what that means is that some of their factories are not producing at the capacity that they normally can, because the government is shutting down power 1 or 2 days a week. And as a result, it means that there is a little less volume coming out of China, Southern China, coming to our ports on the West Coast. So right now, there's a little decrease in overall demand on the ports. And in particular, the Port of LA, which is one of the main ports that we transact business through, has recently agreed to go to a 7x24 operating model. They were not working 7x24 until just recently. We think it's going to take a few weeks for them to actually get effective at the capacity increase on the 7x24 operations. But that, along with a little bit reduced demand coming from China, we believe will start to clear up some of the port congestion in Q4 of this year. But that, again, is not any kind of commitment that port is not going to get congested again going into next year. We have been seeing, and Nathan has talked to me about this, we've been seeing overall ocean freight demand in a sustained, for months and months now, that is record breaking. It's more inbound freight than we normally see during the Black Friday stocking up period, or even the Christmas period. And it's been sustained month on month for a very long time. So we don't see the overall demand on freight dropping anytime soon. What we do believe is that the ports will finally start to be less congested. So, we have product that's been sitting on the ships out in the harbor around the Port of LA. At any given time, we may have product that's sitting out there for 2 weeks. That doesn't necessarily translate to stockouts, but what it does translate to is unpredictability. And so getting back that predictability will help overall with this stuff. So those are kind of all the general signals that we're seeing from the industry in terms of timing. What I believe is that we're going to continue to be challenged on the supply chain side through the rest of 2022. But I also, I know that any stock out is bad, and we cause you all pain with any stock out. But I feel very fortunate to have the team that we do, that comes to work every day to try to solve those problems for us all, because they do a great job.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jeff, Nathan, Brian. It's been awesome. Thank you very much. I think the goal of this, when we kind of thought this up, was to, and I used the analogy earlier, is, all this is like an onion. You keep peeling back and you find another piece and another piece, another piece. And a lot of that I've seen that's been shared, at least in our industry, has just focused on one item of it. And that's what I wanted to, and thought was provide our partners with a little bit more detail to help them understand what all is going on and all the different aspects. So Really appreciate the time and all the efforts. And I think with that, and appreciate everyone's time for joining, of course, and taking time out of the busy day and away from jobs to join us. Hopefully it was beneficial to you as well. Again, Jeff, Nathan, Brian, I really appreciate the time on both webinars for you guys joining. With that, Gary, take it away.
Yeah, you know, there is a comment where an anonymous attendee is kind of summing this up, and it's, you know, this was never intended to be a complete solve. It just was an attempt at us to be transparent and get the best of the best to articulate from their perspective what they go through on a daily basis, which I believe our partners do believe. We work our butts off every single day, and we know in support of that, you guys are out there doing the same thing. I think one of the lines he is mentioning here is, you know, they're asking their end users to trust them, and so the fight continues. But bottom line is, I was hoping to show you what kind of goes behind the scenes in when you're checking our website, you know, and trying to find each and every single day answers to solving the great invoice problem, which is, you know, what we're all up against every day. Getting that invoice complete, that's getting you paid at the end of the day. That's the victory. We're all in the same fight together. So great team, guys. I hope this did help. I'm going to ask them back. Let's continue to do that. You know, I'm not in this same context, but I just love the transparency. So Jeff and Brian, Andy, of course, and Nathan, thank you guys so much for your time today and expertise. Truly a pleasure to be part of the same team with you guys. And from all of us at the Snap One locations, where sure, we're out here in the trenches, we have a lot of fun. There are a lot of choices. Third party, one part, I mean, there really is. And there's a lot of victories. Our dealers, our partners are genuinely doing well. They're healthy. The business is doing well overall. And I'm going to take that as an accolade going forward, for us to continue to be smarter, work healthy. And we're going to plow into Q1 with a full head of steam, so to speak. But anyway, guys, thank you so much. I'll be back next week on our weekly webinar series, as I am each and every Wednesday with Effects Luminaire. Look in your inbox on Friday morning with a complete breakdown and the recorded content here. Guys, thank you once again. You're all busy out there. Stay safe. And Steve, or Brian, gotta say, go Dodger Blue. See you guys later.